I think it's one of those things that, like most things in government, it sounds nice and there's pretty rainbows and pictures painted, but in reality, it's probably one of those things that doesn't really work. But
The Democrats do not think it's all rainbows. The Democrats fought vigorously and ferociously against this bill. They said that all the money was going to be basically taken from public schools. Welcome to episode 69 of the Weekly Docket. Today is May 8th, 2025. As usual, we're talking practical law and legal news. My name is Phil Silberman. I'm the owner of the firm and your host, and I'm joined by Chris Heald, the firm's supervising attorney, who has joined us again, thankfully. Chris, what's going on today?
it's still on the rock. That's all I can do.
Let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about what is on our docket. And we've got three topics. Should be a short show. We're talking about school vouchers and the Senate Bill 2, which is a big deal. It passed. Okay. It's actually becoming law. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to do a little eminent domain, which surprisingly is always really popular in Texas. We get huge number of views on social media platforms anytime we do eminent domain stuff. So apparently there's a lot of interest in it. And then finally, we're going to rant and rave a little bit about attorney turnover and some of the chaos that's currently going on in firms with lawyer turnover and some of the hiring woes there. So that's our show. I hope it's a good show. Let's get it kicked off with our legal news section. And the first thing we're talking about is this $1 billion school voucher program, that's Senate Bill 2. We had Mays Middleton. I think he was one of the sponsors of the bills for this educational program. It's extremely controversial. It allocates $1 billion for private education. That's, if you're a parent, you've got kids, you can get some money to send your kids to private school instead of public school. You have any thoughts on that, Chris? Is that something you like?
I think it's one of those things that, like most things in government, it sounds nice and there's pretty rainbows and pictures painted, but in reality, it's probably one of those things that doesn't really work. But the tax dollars are going to it. I want it to succeed. I obviously want children to be successful, but from my experiences, I have my doubts. I feel like I say that a lot on this podcast.
The Democrats do not think it's all rainbows. The Democrats fought vigorously and ferociously against this bill. They said that all the money was going to be basically taken from public schools. We had Mays Middleton on the show, who is now running for attorney general. He says we can do both. You can serve kids in public schools and you can let kids, give parents choice, let them go to private schools if they want. So that's what it's supposed to do. Let me give you a couple of details, or a handful of details of what this thing is going to do. First of all, Greg Abbott signed it into law this past Saturday. That was May 3rd, I think. Senate Bill 2, each student can get up to $10,900 annually for private school tuition, for textbooks, transportation, and educational needs. But you have to pull them out of public school. They can't be in public school. All right. And if you're a disabled kid, children with disabilities, you can get an additional $30,000, which I think is great. And they came up with that number because that's the amount they estimate that it costs the public school to service a child with disabilities. And if you're a homeschool kid, you can get $2,000. This is per year. What do you think about those numbers?
I don't have an issue with the numbers. The numbers make sense. But to your point, exactly where you're hitting the heart of the issue, where does the money come from? If it comes from tax dollars, if it comes from my property taxes, your property taxes, everyone's property taxes, there's only so much money the government has. And if they're giving money to private schools, you're telling me they're either coming up with more money from somewhere or they're taking from the pot they already have. And Spring Branch ISD and HISD is going to get less money. So you got to pick one.
The Republicans say, no, you don't. Okay. And you're making no, great point. You're making the Democrat argument. The Republicans say, I think we currently spend 90 billion. That's 90 billion on public schools. So the Republicans say, look, we're just taking one of 90 to do this program. Now, the public school people are saying any dollar you take is a dollar away from public schools. That's the way you feel about it.
Look, hey, nothing in this show is the personal opinion of me necessarily. I'm not here to give you my opinions. I'm telling you what the argument is, and I can see the argument. Okay. I'm not dying on either ill.
Okay.
As I said, I want it to work. And if it does work, great. I'm not raising up against Abbott. I'm not raising up in favor of Abbott. My concern is I'm more concerned that it doesn't work, that it is this thing that I remember Bush pushing in 2001 and learning about it in high school and growing up in a red state, listening to the arguments for and against. The arguments that Bush and Gore had on education, I think were actually good when politicians actually argued about issues and respected each other instead of just screaming at each other and calling each other names. And I think Bush had some good ideas, but I think at the end of the day, the voucher program has just been shown not to work. It doesn't mean I don't want it to work. It doesn't mean I don't understand the goals. I don't necessarily agree with the left-leaning thinking that you just keep increasing school funding and that'll make schools better, right? We do need to do better things. We can't just double the funding to schools and suddenly expect our schools to be twice as good. But everybody will agree, or I think everybody will say, everybody in a school system is going to say schools are underfunded. We could always pay teachers more. We could use newer textbooks, newer science equipment, newer playground equipment, anything. Schools can always benefit from more money. And so anything that takes away from the school is a big concern. Yep. And the other side of that, maybe you were going to get to, the other side of that is, who's this really helping? What I think is more likely is the kids that are already in private school are just going to take this money and the private schools are just going to jack up their tuition. And so the private
that was a big concern of the left, that you were going to just give this to kids already in private schools. And that was a big fight. And it did get passed where kids already in private schools will be eligible for the money, but they decided they're going to prioritize kids who are in public schools that are going to transition to private schools. So the kids already in public schools will get some priority. And then again, to your point, is this inflationary, right? Are the private schools going to increase tuition? And they might.
100% they will, no doubt. And I like the hard luck case. That's who we want to help, right? The parent who can't afford private school gets this little bump, says, awesome, I'm willing to drive my kid across town to get him into private school, to get my kid the better opportunity. There's going to be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 of those. And good for that kid. But that's the hard luck case that they want to point to about giving kids opportunities. And that's really not going to come to fruition because the parents still got to get them to school. That's going to be the main impediment to getting these kids into private school. And they are going to raise tuition. So it's just going to be, what'd you say the number was? 10,900. So they're just going to raise tuition by 10,900. And so everybody who's in private school, the parents aren't even going to win. So even the parents who have kids in private school who are going to say, hey, this is going to give me a little break, I love it, they're not going to see that break either. They're going to still pay the same tuition they're paying. The private schools are just going to get the money. And if that's what Abbott wants, great. The private schools can have fun.
The law passed. Okay, so we're stuck with it. Let's at least talk about who's going to qualify for this. So How do you qualify? And this is, I think, the most important thing. The left is just screaming about this is all for rich people and wealthy people. I don't see it that way. The cap is a family of 4 making $160,000, which is 500% above the poverty line. That sounds like a lot of money, but in places like Houston and Dallas, it's really not. If you make 160 grand a year and you've got a family of 4, I would say that is squarely really middle class when you factor in the cost of housing and food and how much it costs to clothe 6 people, 2 parents, 4 kids. Or if we're talking about 2 kids and 2 parents, family of 4, basically, 160 grand is not a ton of money. I think, I'm hoping, I'm optimistic, as you say, Chris, the hard luck case, who this is really going to help is maybe someone who's living in the suburbs or a neighborhood that's not so great. The schools have really failed them. Maybe it's a single mom making 60 grand a year. Maybe it's a 2 income family making 125 grand a year. And they get this bump and they can drive about 10 minutes, maybe across the tracks, across the freeway, if you will, and put their kids in a school that maybe the tuition is affordable for them. Maybe that tuition is 15, 20 grand a year, primarily like at a Catholic school, Chris, because it's really only the Catholic schools that have affordable tuition now. And I don't think people know this. And we live in Houston. If you want to send your kids to like Kincaid or Houston Christian or Second Baptist, and I'm just throwing, or Episcopal, I think the tuition is like 35 grand a year at some of these places. So if you make 100 grand a year and you've got 2 kids, you get 10 grand a year and you need to come up with that additional 20. Now they may get some financial aid and additional, but if you need to come up with an additional 20, that might as well be $200,000 to a family of 4 making 100 grand a year. So I don't know that these kids are really going to get into all of a sudden these elite private schools in places like Dallas and Houston are really going to become extremely doable or affordable. I'm hoping that this helps the kind of the fringe neighborhood where they're going to go to something like a second tier private school, but it's going to be way better than the public school. That's my hope. That's how I see it working out. So you got
Yeah,
any
I
thoughts
think
on
you're
that?
right. Well, again, that's what I want. And I actually lived in a neighborhood that would have been the absolute perfect example, because we did send our kids to the private school that was 3 minutes away from our house, even though we lived across the street from an elementary school. But you would not, don't want to name anything. So don't anybody ask any names. But we would never send our kid to the elementary school across the street. And we toured it, we looked at it. We liked the idea of a neighborhood school, but the grades kept going down and down. It was not a well-run school, obviously part of HISD, which has its own problems. And so, yes, to take them to the 3 minute away school was our choice. But when this started happening, I would have bet you plenty of money that the tuition that we were paying, all they would have done is doubled it. So now they would say, okay, thanks for the government voucher. Now cut us the check that you were cutting last year. So it's not going to help us. It's just going to help them, which fine. You want to help private Catholic schools. I hope they do something great with the money, but
Yeah. And it's not just, yeah, and it's not just Catholic schools. We just use as an example because it's one of the few private schools left that are charging a semi-reasonable tuition rate. And that the name in St. Michael's comes to mind in Houston, or St. Cecilia's in Houston. Those private school tuition rates are way lower than some of the other private schools. Look, we'll see how this comes out. The law is going to go into effect on September 1st, 2026. I'm very curious to see how much of the $1 billion actually gets used. If it does, it's going to prioritize military families. It's going to prioritize kids with disabilities. It's going to prioritize, obviously, some of these lower income families. And if none of those families want the money, then it can go to the real rich people. Okay. People making huge amounts of money, but it's only allowed 20% of the entire budget is only allowed for that. We'll see how it comes out. We'll see how much of this money is actually used. We'll see if it's a success. Chris is skeptical as usual, but we'll see how it goes. All right. We've got to move on to our next section, and that's our legal questions section. And in this one, we're talking about the eminent domain process in Texas. Why are we talking about that? Because we now are doing a little bit of eminent domain work at the firm, not something we like to do, but there's been some reasons for that. Chris, there are only a handful of eminent domain lawyers in Texas, eminent domain law firms that really do specialize in eminent domain. And they're all set up on a contingency model. Can you explain to the listeners how an eminent domain contingency might work, Chris?
If someone wants to take your land, if an agency, a governmental agency, city, county wants to take your land, they're going to offer you a price. And you're going to say, no, price is not high enough. And then you go hire an attorney, and that attorney is going to try to get you a higher price. And so the fee structure they're going to offer you is the difference between the price that's initially offered and the price they get you ultimately. And then they take a percentage of that. So if they offer you 100 and then they get you 200, the difference is 100, and they take X percent of $100,000.
Yeah, and it's usually about a third. It's usually 33%, sometimes as high as 40%. Now, if you don't have money to pay an attorney hourly, that may be something you have to do where you take a contingency deal. Or if you want a really specialized attorney, that's often what these eminent domain lawyers are going to offer because they make more money. They make a lot more money doing contingency work than they do on billable hourly rate. Even if it's a very high billable hourly rate, their numbers are still better on a contingency model. Now, it probably works better if you're like a one-off, you're a farmer and they're taking a little bit of your land and it's not extremely material to you, or they're going to take the whole property and you're going to take the money as a bonus and go home kind of thing. It doesn't work for everybody. And especially if you've got some income producing property and you've got a spreadsheet and a model where your development is modeled to make X dollars, it doesn't work for you to take a 30 or 40% haircut on a big chunk of that property. So you see a lot of sophisticated commercial players that just cannot make that type of contingency model work. Now, in fairness to some of these eminent domain law firms, they are trying to work with them and do like a stair step type contingency model, kind of lessen the blow a little bit. But usually some of these big commercial players, they want the hourly rate. That's what they're used to paying. They just can't stomach a 30% or 40% big reduction in their budget on some of these properties. That means we're doing a little bit of eminent domain work. Sometimes we'd be willing to take it on contingency, but we also take it on our regular hourly rates. So let's talk a little bit, Chris, just about the basic process. Take the listeners through sort of the steps of very basically what eminent domain is going to look like.
And remember, for anyone who maybe hasn't listened, or if you're first hearing this term for the first time ever, the government is actually allowed to just take your property away from you. If they say, hey, we're the government, we have a better use for your land than you have for it, or we need it for public use, the Constitution says they are just allowed to take it away from you. But they do have to pay you. And they have to pay you a reasonable rate or a market rate or a fair rate. And so they start with a low offer. Like any negotiator, they're going to start low. So even though they're required under the Constitution to give you a reasonable rate, they start on what would be considered a very low end of that spectrum of reasonable. And so you can either take that offer and say, hey, I think it's reasonable and I just really don't want to fight them. Or you can say, no, thank you, either verbally or in writing responding to them or by ignoring them completely. And so that is your first step, is either accepting their initial offer or politely declining their initial offer, whether through silence or through a response. And if they want to work with you, they can, or they can just say, okay, I guess we're going to have to take this to court. And then they file a lawsuit.
I want to emphasize that step 2, you're combining the step 1 and 2, which is they make you an offer and then you've got the opportunity to negotiate it, which is fine. Usually it does not settle at that point, unless you're a property owner that just maybe naively takes some of the lowball offers, which you don't want to do. But we encourage people to get an attorney at this very early process. And then Chris was moving on to step 3, which is the condemnation filing. I think a lot of people get confused. It's actually the jurisdiction that has to file the lawsuit. You don't get to sue the government. The government sues you for the condemnation for the taking. And then you get into the formal court proceeding process, which then we've got listed as step 4, which is before you get a jury trial. What happens, Chris?
Before that, they appoint a commission, and that commission's going to do some research and come up with a value. And they're going to say, okay, this is what we think should be the value of the property. And if you want to take that, you can take it. So it is one step above that. It's an offer that's being made by them effectively that the jurisdiction doesn't really have a choice over. So even if it's higher than what the jurisdiction like to offer, they're stuck with it. But you don't have to take it still. You can still say, no, still not good enough. We're trying this case.
Yeah, you can go to court. And if you don't like, you get 2 bites at the apple. So at step 4, they're going to appoint the special commissioners. It's usually 3 local landowners in the area, or three people that get appointed. They'll decide the compensation. If you don't like it, you don't have to take it. Then you get into court and you do the whole trial. It's usually in county or district court in Texas. And Chris, you're a trial attorney. You've tried cases before. This is going to look no different than a damages component of the trial. There's no liability here. It's a given. The government wants your property. The whole thing is just the damages portion of the trial. And Chris, what do you have to have in any good damages portion of a trial to be successful?
You have to have a good expert.
Yeah. And that's really important in these cases. And the expert in this type of case is going to be an appraiser. And what the premier eminent domain law firms will tell you, I don't know if this is true, but this is what they'll tell you, that they have all the good appraisers locked down. And it's difficult to get a good appraiser if you're not one of the handful of those firms. Now, I don't know if that's exactly true, but there are appraisers out there that they do a lot of testimony, a lot of eminent domain work, and they're probably more experienced, more sophisticated, a little bit better presenting an appraisal that's going to favor the property owner than just your run-of-the-mill appraiser that's out there doing all kinds of appraisals. So the key on this is going to be getting a good appraiser. Chris, you remember one time we were doing a case up in Montgomery County, and you had it was a surveyor. You had a surveyor on the stand, and I walk in the courtroom, and I knew it was going bad because the surveyor was hanging his head. And the next thing I heard him say was, "The numbers just aren't coming to him at the moment." I said, "Oh boy."
We've repeated that line so many times over the last 15 years.
Right.
The number coming to me.
So Chris, when you put your appraiser on the stand, that's about the worst thing you can possibly have him say, is when you're asking him to give a really good number for that property owner. You better hope he doesn't say, "The numbers just aren't coming to me." So
it's not a good look. It's certainly not a good look. I did my best to rehabilitate him, give him his report and say, "Hey, would it refresh your memory if you had provided me with a report that may have said this?" And he said, "Oh, yes."
Chris did good work on that.
So your point on the other guys, though, and I'm just offering my thoughts. I mean, I'm a contrarian. You do have to have the appraisers, but one of the things that any attorney is going to do in cross-examining your witness is they're always going to say, "And how often do you testify against the government?" And, 250 cases, and 250 cases, you've testified that the government's too low. That's funny. You don't think the government.
That's an excellent point. And Chris is pointing out the silver lining in having an appraiser or an expert that doesn't testify all the time, because all the previous expert work he has done can't be used against him. So there may be a benefit in using an appraiser with a clean slate. So Chris, that's an excellent point. That's our point of the day, as a matter of fact. All right. So look, summary of eminent domain. Step 1, you're going to get an initial offer from the government. It's probably a lowball offer. You probably don't want to take it. You can have an opportunity to get your own appraisal and do a little negotiation. Probably doesn't settle there because your counteroffer is going to come in way high. Step 3, the government's going to file a lawsuit for condemnation. You're going to do a commissioner's hearing with 3 local people appointed to hear the testimony and make a decision of value. You can take that offer if you like it. And if you don't like it, step 5, you can appeal and you can do an actual trial on the value of the property in county or district court. That is eminent domain in the state of Texas in a nutshell. And that, Chris, brings us to my favorite part of the show, which is our rant and rave section. You and I, Chris, we do a lot of this hiring and bringing new people on and transitioning new attorneys out. And there was just an article that came out, I think it was in Bloomberg here recently at the end of April, just talking about how big law firms are in trouble because all of their COVID hires, the people they hired in 2021, their new associates, basically have left the firm. So the numbers we're seeing in this article, Chris, 71% of associates hired in years 20 and 21 that during COVID have basically already left big law firms. And I think that number's underreported because my friends are telling me that have run big law firms, they're telling they think the number's closer to 90%. So why is that a problem, Chris?
I suppose it's a problem for them if they can't get any value out of associates, because my understanding of kind of their business model is they're recruiting the top talent straight out of law school. But for the first couple of years, it's hard to get real value out of them because they're brand new attorneys. And so I think one of the things they do is write down a lot of their time because their clients are paying them six figures in legal fees. So they write off the associate time, or they're just not as efficient as the older attorneys. And then they're stepping their way up to becoming partners. If they're just coming in, working that 3 years, which I think is what the requirement is before you have to pay your signing bonus back. They work that 3 years. And then as soon as they clear that benchmark, they're saying, hey, I'm moving on to other things. The one of my best friends straight out of law school, that was always his plan. His plan was always do his 3 years. I grew up in a military family. It's kind of like enlist, do your 4 years and get out. So it's kind of get out.
Bloomberg is calling it an ROI crisis. Okay. That's what Bloomberg is calling it. These kids get paid a ton of money for knowing nothing. Like some of these big firms are paying 225 grand a year for these kids that just know nothing and can do nothing, in hopes that eventually they'll be able to bill enough hours to get a return on that. Now, some big firms have walked that back. They just said, we're not going to pay that kind of money. But if you're paying 225 times 3 and you're not making these kids profitable until years 3 or 4, and then they're all gone, that's an issue. And then now you have no experienced lawyers to raise the rates that can do billable rates. And that's the backbone of any law firm. It's not actually the partner billing. The partner billing is fine. I mean, the partners are going to make money and they're going to bill and they're going to work hard, but all the scalability, we've talked before about scalability, all the scalability is based on your non-equity owning attorneys billing hours. And if they're not billing hours because they're all gone, then that's a problem for the law firm. So Chris, here's another statistic that absolutely shocked me. Does this surprise you? Across all law firms, not just big law firms, only 20% of associates are now at the same law firm after 5 years. Chris, if we start an attorney and 5 years later, he's still going to be at the firm, you can expect 1 in 5 to stick around. Does that shock you, Chris?
No, it would have shocked me 15 years ago. Today, I'd surprise the number's 5.
Yeah. Okay.
3 or 4.
Chris and I are seeing the same things even at our firm. It's just hard to keep people in this kind of culture where there's just so much moving about, so much turnover. And the scary thing is, Chris, pre-COVID, it was higher. It's down 25%. So the number is actually going down in the number of attorneys that are sticking at your firm or any firm. There's just a loyalty trend problem. And it's not like these attorneys are making huge sums more money at other places. That's just very rare. It's often, I don't know why they're changing. Maybe it's culture, something they don't like. Maybe they're jumping around for a little bit more money, but it's not significantly different. The article on Bloomberg is basically speculating that law firms, Chris, they need to reinvent themselves as is some other type of model to keep from bleeding talent, to somehow retain talent. I would say, I don't know what that looks like at a big firm. I don't know what a big firm is going to do. I think, Chris, we've been successful at employing a model that does a good job of that. We're giving people a life-work balance. We're saying, look, we're not going to require 80 hours a week from you. Give us 40, 45, 50 hours a week, something reasonable. You have an opportunity to make more money if you work more, but if you don't and you just want your basics, then you can have a job as long as you're doing decent quality work. And I think that's something we've been successful with. But do you see big firms being able to successfully implement that type of model, Chris?
No, I really don't think this is limited to law firms. I know as we're lawyers, this is what we talk about, but my wife's in the event industry. Everybody in the event industry moves around, and she's a corporate event planner. So she works with a lot of companies, and she'll work with somebody at one company for 2 years, and then they leave that company and then they go to another company. It's the trend now. We grew up in a different time. I grew up being told, don't chase an extra dollar per hour. Don't go chase an extra $10,000 in salary. It looks bad. You do that a couple times, you'll never be hireable again. My parents were wrong. Maybe it was true when they were growing up and they were getting employed. It's not true today. You're not going to shoot yourself in the foot by chasing that extra dollar an hour or that extra $10,000 in salary. The numbers have proven that those people make more money over their careers, and the working class is the one that drives it. workers of the world unite. That's what they do. They change the culture and they make it happen.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I can speak from experience. Just 4 or 5 years ago when I would review resumes, Chris, I would throw resumes away if I saw that they weren't with a law firm for over 3 years.
You tried to do that, and now you can't do it.
You can't do that anymore. No,
Yeah.
Chris is right. You cannot do that anymore. I will say, to counter Chris's comment and point, we do see you have to be careful in a lawyer type environment because especially if you don't have your own book of business, you're dependent on that firm to provide you a book. And if you're jumping for a little bit more money, if their source of revenue or there's a market change dries up, then it's not just about money, but are you with a law firm that has stability of work generation? And we have had several lawyers, Chris, as we're not going to mention any names, that have asked for jobs back when the work at the firm they jumped to dried up. And that does happen. So you need to be careful with that. And if you're seeing shifts in the market, but big problems for big law right now, and it's chaos, a crisis of turnover. They haven't seen this before. I don't know how they're going to adapt to it. I would counsel them to do some things that the smaller law firms like ours are doing and maybe try to be profitable, develop models to get those associates to be profitable more immediately, maybe not pay so much for the associates, tone down some of the hourly requirements and see if you can make the numbers work and see how that goes.
Right. For them, they do have an unusual business model specific to law firms. They want you, and this is how I came up. And I did not graduate top 5% of my class, so I was not offered one of these jobs. But I was fully ready to do that, to just make all the sacrifices, work 90 hours a week, never see your family. I didn't have a girlfriend getting out of law school, so I could have not gotten married, not had kids for a long time and just killed myself working. But that's just not the culture anymore. People don't want to do that. And I think it used to be a sense of pride. You make fun of me for that all the time. You say, Chris, that lawyer doesn't exist anymore. The old school, the old office, and just that system isn't there anymore, where the guy just expects everybody working weekends and holidays.
Well, he's still there. He's 60 years old, and
Right.
he's one of the small number of people still in the downtown office. And he walks around the office about every couple hours and complains to his buddies why none of the associates are coming in. And he's also
9 o'clock at night, wondering why everybody went home early, saying, why isn't everybody still here?
He's also the guy who's got like the big fancy leather, like attorney file carrying case. He's that guy too. All right. He's still out there, Chris. There's still a place. There's still a place. All right. That has to bring our show to a close. I've been your host, Phil Silberman. Chris Heald has been our co-host today. Thank you so much, Chris. As a reminder, nothing in this show is to be considered legal advice. This has all been for entertainment purposes only. Please share the podcast, review us wherever you get your podcasts. Please do so. If you have a legal question, email us at info@silblawfirm.com, and we will give it a shot. And everybody have a great week and weekend, everybody.